Okay,
You'll tell Mike if it's an unfair question.
Yeah, you're like the buzzer.
Okay, guys, so we're live, and you can start whenever you want to.
Cool. Okay, so thanks everybody for coming. This is the Zero Access release event for Jake Reber's book. At the end, we'll have a link to the book on the 1111 Press store. So just for those interested, Zero Access is a work of ambient body horror depicting the birth and growth of strange organisms. Creatures spawn from the maw of the text. Watch as they fester in the dark, illuminated only by the reflection of the monitor screen. The data glut bleeds out into desolate landscapes of zeros and ones, biocosmic distortions, pixel vibration, flesh plane flatness. Using cut-up techniques, warped imagery, and diagrammatic visual poetry, Jake Reber explores the relationship between the organic and the digital. Pages are designed for slow scanning more than reading, excavating the yet unknown terrains of databases and dead websites. So, hear Jake Reber talk about his book. I feel like a great place to start is just to kind of, with that first phrase, what is ambient body horror? I'm kind of fascinated by that combination of something that's kind of terrifying and kind of ominous mixed with something that's supposed to be like ambient and kind of unconscious. So you kind of explore that term.
Cool, yeah. I mean, I feel like we've talked about this a little bit before, and I think it emerged through some of our conversations. And it's interesting because like this wasn't something I had considered prior to the full text coming together. And it's shaped a lot of the initial reading of the text too. Like I'm interested in how this kind of subtitle is actually, is the first interaction people have with the text. But in all the way those terms start to reconfigure the way that each of them kind of operate on their own. Like the ambience, I was like spending a lot of time listening to ambient music and reading the work of Tan Lin, which like quite radically shifted my priorities in constructing this text. And then I was also watching a lot of like body horror and getting really interested in horror, which was something I hadn't spent much time with. And thinking about these two kind of modes crossing one another. So looking at like mundane sites of horror, which is like explored in some things related to like bureaucracy and spending time in like really mindless dead types of texts are also really horrifying in ways that are quite different maybe than you'd anticipate with like under the kind of larger umbrella of this idea of horror. So like interested in that kind of reverberation through those terms, both this kind of mundane and environmental sense, as well as like this maybe more like creeping terror that like sort of soaks the text.
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned how that subtitle came late in the process, but once you had attached that to it, it felt like everything kind of like clicked, like that kind of sense of like the like unconscious slow scan of horror. It was like always there, but we didn't exactly have like a proper phrase to describe it, because there's not like a lot of per se like physical settings to the book, but it almost feels like you're just slowly creeping through like a long abandoned like laboratory setting with all the vials broken and like these mentions of like things like Splicer and these like images depicting like distorted tentacles. And speaking of body horror, you had like the scanner's head explosion distorted into this almost like globular shape. And I'm really interested kind of in that direction, how you use that reappropriated media to create this really ominous feeling. Not only, as I mentioned, are you distorting movie stills, but you're also reappropriating text from Wikipedia, usually really like biological, scientific text that's describing like in-depth chemical processes happening in the body. And there's something so unsettling about this, like, kind of, it's that slow zoom into something so detailed that it's familiar because it's your body, but it's also so foreign because you've never thought of it on that incredibly complex and kind of microscopic detail.
Yeah, the so like as far as like the appropriated media, I mean, some of that is just like the way in which I navigate the internet is often just like pulling random things that I think are interesting and saving and kind of like creating a personal archive that will eventually kind of reemerge in text. Part of this is because I really struggle with like generating material like organically, and find this kind of process of curating and like, taking all of this like excess and all of this trash from the internet and trying to reprocess it until it's something that I'm interested in, or think maybe there's like potential connections that emerge between various bits. And as far as like the images that are like being reworked constantly, some of that is purely the types of limitations that I have at the moment, which is I'm like rarely by my computer. I'm doing a lot of my reading from PDFs on my phone, and I do a lot of the editing work. Even a lot of the images throughout this text were all made on my phone, running it through a variety of different apps. Sometimes it's actually just taking chunks of text and reprocessing it until you have these weird spatialized images. And other pieces are just distorted, beyond recognition from the original source material.
Yeah, and I'm flipping through my book real quick because there's one here we go. There's really great image, speaking of text distortions, that you almost turn kind of the text itself into this spatial element. And a lot of that, I know hysterically real, you talk a lot about like the process of reading and scanning, which makes a lot of sense on the PDF. And that connection to PDFs makes a lot of sense as the intake, that you're kind of just like scrolling down. You don't necessarily need to capture every word, but I like how you managed to do that in kind of this physical setting. And not only that, but you managed to kind of spatialize the text itself with those distortions.
Cool. Yeah. Like PDFs, I am obviously like through Hysterically Real, we like pretty much exclusively are producing PDFs. And most of my reading experiences are unfortunately with PDFs, because I actually really hate reading text that way, or at least texts that are intended to be, printed and are scanned back in or whatever, are really brutal to read. So I was interested in other works as well as, some of the original versions of what this was when it was just existing on the internet, trying to produce material that fit the format of the PDF, things that are built for scanning, things that you don't have to spend an incredible amount of time on the per page viewing. I mean, this is like still a pretty long book, but the actual amount of text, it's like under 10,000 words, I think. So it's something you can kind of rapidly flip through and kind of resist a traditional kind of movement from page to page. There's opportunities to actually do whatever you want with this text, and even the type of like metadata that like runs along the edges of pages hopefully provide another way of entering into the space of the book.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because so a lot of the times that the text pops up throughout the book are as kind of these thin stanzas, but in I want to say like the final third of the book, there's this block text that's appropriated from Wikipedia that's almost jarring to come upon the first time, because you're so used to scanning that you get this really kind of impactful change in the pace that you're not used to reading in a more traditional way. And so once that hits, you're like, oh, and you realize kind of like how much you've been navigating it unconsciously, and haven't necessarily been paying attention as you've kind of moved through it. And so it almost feels like you kind of inverted that process of, rather than scanning the physical document in to a database, you've kind of printed out that database and made it a physical document, maybe more effectively than people scanning the PDFs. This was not agonizing to read. It's actually such a strange, it's like it's almost like I hate to compare it to like a Tarkovsky movie because it feels like everyone's go-to for like dreamlike pacing, but it's that thing where it's like I could fall asleep during this and wake back up and feel like it's invaded my dreams. Like it, it kind of like sticks with you in this kind of unsettling way, even though there's no kind of like outright horror elements, as you mentioned. It's like sheer atmosphere a lot of the time.
That's amazing. I mean, that connection like to film. I've had a lot of conversations recently with friends when I'm realizing that I basically have absolutely no interest in, at least in film, in any sort of like narrative or plot. Like I just am looking for interesting environments, aesthetics, and like vibes from the film. Like just put me somewhere that's interesting. And I was hoping, or maybe some of that type of thinking also kind of bled into this project as well. That, along with some of the things you were saying before too about the shifting in types of reading, for sure makes me think of Tanlin's idea of reading as a kind of integrated software. It's you have these variety of different tasks that we often think of, reading between like this pretty narrow framework where there's a variety of other tasks that are actually part of this reading apparatus that we don't necessarily consider to be a part of the act of reading. He even talks about, most of the act of reading actually happens before you even arrive at the book, which I think that probably is true with this text. There's really very little reading that needs to happen once you open up the first page.
Yeah, it's almost like it's more like into like an interface. Like I'm not necessarily sitting there going paragraph by paragraph. It's very much just like eyes kind of sticking to the image and kind of reading. It's almost even a lot of the text appears as like visual data that you're kind of taking in. Sometimes you'll have things like words broken up by brackets or like various kind of symbols. And so even though you'll be able to read through, there's this sense that you're just kind of scanning through it like you would like icons in an interface, which is really kind of impressive.
Thank you.
I feel like anytime I mention anything about the book, I immediately just start flipping through it again. It's just like instinctual to start interacting more.
It's really hard for me to kind of articulate, what this book is doing, because that really wasn't even like a driving question behind the process of creating. It was just going back through files and looking at things and throwing them into a document or a PowerPoint project to the editing.
Which I think is maybe the next thing to talk about is the fact that you made this in, I think it's 2007 PowerPoint is what you were telling me.
That was the original. I think I had my computer like did some updating. So parts of it I think were made in the 2016 PowerPoint. But yeah, the starting point was this 2007, which had like really different types of features and obviously has numerous constraints on doing book design and dealing with layout issues. And we had a lot of problems with doing like color matching as well, which if you want to talk about some of that, you're welcome to.
Yeah.
Because you actually had to deal with the final issues once I sent off this.
When I was laying out the book after we had gotten that first proof, we had noticed that there was a discrepancy between different shades of black in the book. It wasn't kind of matching them, so we had some parts that were rich black and some parts that were pure black. So some that were just no color, just all the way on the black shader, and then some that had RGB, and then also the full black. And so there's these different, like it was almost like watching like it killed the printer in some capacity. So going through that, it was kind of like trying to dissect what like PowerPoint had done. And so there's this way that you had made the book in PowerPoint and had been using its anachronistic constraints. And then I had to investigate how you would put it together after we got that first proof, which was really fun. I'm seeing that we have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
He's curious about the connection between ambient work and horror/body horror. and wants to know about the horror potential of an ambient mode of writing occurring naturally through reading.
That's a great question. Hello, Grant. I think that it's for sure, yeah, it happened like naturally through almost less through the reading and more through just the construction of this, like things randomly kind of falling together. A lot of this idea of the like ambient body horror was a framing that was applied after it, like looking at this network of materials and the way that they're interacting with one another. I think the first time I kind of made this connection was a previous project I was working on. It was bureaucratic typologies, which is just like these descriptions of basically an empty office building. And a lot of the framing of that actually ends up being a pretty horrifying, like super sterile, inhuman environment. And at that point is, I think, where I like started to see the potential of looking at these types of ambient zones and the way in which it could map back onto horror, and then also thinking about this in relationship, to the body and body horror.
Yeah, and I think part of that is, I think that older technology is beginning to have this kind of like unsettling quality to it. Like if you see like an old like home video or something like that, there's this eerie sense. And so I think when we start interacting in this book with these like kind of seemingly abandoned like digital spaces, it's like stumbling upon like an old Web 2.0 page with like some like unsettling like horror story on it or something. Like there's this sense that it's like very visceral information being pulled out of this like completely abandoned part of the internet that's completely public but just forgotten about, or through like a lack of streamlined navigation just never gets kind of like stumbled upon. Like it feels like finding the data that it's just been like forgotten about for so long.
I think there's also like something with various types of media and like processes of like documentation and mediation also have been like a site of horror. I mean, like the really concrete example that like immediately pops to mind is like in The Ring, right? You have like the VHS as like this weird sort of portal horror object, and even the aesthetics of the of like the scanning and the type of like glitchiness that you kind of see in these types of like media, I think provide something that kind of moves between this text and maybe some of these other sites of horror.
Yeah, and I think there's something interesting about like extracting the occult from these like highly technological spaces, like in this or like in The Ring. Another example that comes to mind is this small game called No Player Online that takes place in like a defunct like multiplayer server, where it's these things that are like seemingly familiar starting to kind of twist into these like unfamiliar or seemingly sentient forms. Is so like terrifying. I don't know exactly why, but just that idea that like the tech, like the device isn't necessarily fully under your control as we tend to think it is. There's this kind of like unknown that's influencing it.
Yeah, I think that like bleeds into some of like the techno mysticism stuff as well. That is like a presence throughout my thinking.
So, and CCR youth looming in the background.
Yeah, I mean, I just had been reading too much of that. It was like frying my brain in ways that I think are like wonderful in some ways and were truly horrifying in others. But it provides a different way of thinking through these processes of mediation, what can happen through these kind of ruptures and the unknown, spaces between something being recorded, how it's actually being inscribed upon various forms of media, and then the way in which it reemerges. And that's something that was very apparent to me in the process of construction of this. Whereas like I obviously was gathering and trying to curate this thing, but without a very clear kind of trajectory or with a plan of how these things were going to hold together.
Yeah, and you had mentioned earlier about the categorization system throughout, which is on the outside margins of certain pages, there's like bracketed metadata, and kind of how you brought that up. It reminds me that we came up with that after we had started editing the book, but that we had the finished kind of manuscript that you had sent to 1111, and then when you and I had started working through the editing process, that kind of came up with an idea. And here I can pull some up so we have some examples. But like,
oh, cool.
We have like the edge of the page here, or we have some here as well. They're just kind of scattered throughout, and it kind of, with that techno-mysticism, it reminds you that something categorized these before you got here, that that metadata had to come from somewhere. And so there's this kind of that unknown force operating behind the text or behind like the surface of the page is kind of reminded to you as you see those, and you're trying to kind of piece together how the piece is supposed to be navigated, as if there's like this intentional kind of like almost choose your adventure, like go to page 7, go to page this, as you look at the tags.
Yeah, and right within the space of the book, like it's impossible to actually trace out those types of links unless you're an incredibly dedicated reader.
Stay tuned. We might one day get an email that's like, okay, I figured out how to properly navigate zero access. I found the correct configuration.
Yeah, I'd love to see like a new version of the text.
And it reminds me of, I was talking to John Treffry from Inside the Castle a month or so ago, and he was telling me about how he got an email about Grant Meyerhofer's book, Parapattern, and about how someone was trying to like pull the book apart and rearrange it because of text running into the gutter. So that I love the idea of like books like that and like yours that are they're so rooted in their like physicality. Like that tactile surface of the page becomes so important to the act of reading versus a lot of like traditional or conventional novels that you'll see that kind of get you sucked into that diegesis and have you just kind of lolling through the page. And this one you're like very much aware of the cursed artifact in your hands.
Yeah, and it seems like texts that are really engaging with the materiality of the book are also like continually putting pressure on the book and what it is trying to do and what it is capable of doing. That's for sure true with like Grant's project. And that obviously is, something that I'm not sure if that was out prior to the final version of this text coming together.
Around the time we were finishing the editing.
So I would say there's a lot of texts from Inside the Castle that are operating in this kind of space that had some sort of pull on this text, even if they had not emerged in the world yet. Yeah,
and I think that comes through a bit with I think 3 of the blurb writers are Inside the Castle authors. We have Jermaine Sierra, Morcozy, and Kitchell all blurred the book, which all feel like such good fits with like Jermaine's kind of technological artifact and Morcozy's like sentient code, and then Kitchell's occult materiality. It feels like such a perfect mix of what zero access is. Just all these authors put into the cauldron.
Yeah, so if you want to like see, more like crystallized and fully formed version of any of these ideas, you can go to those texts. This is kind of like a sampler of that or a remix of that.
And a really interesting work in its own right too, with that inclusion of the body horror. The prominent, I think the only named character in the book is this splicer figure who just, I don't know if they're a tentacle monster or something that crawled out of a vat in a lab, or there's this idea of just like pure biological, like just slimy tissue sentience, like crawling throughout the book. Like it feels like this strange, like semi-cognitive, like figure just like moving with you throughout the text. And a lot of the imagery is very kind of fitting into that body horror. There's a lot of like fascination with like the position of the infant. There's this idea of like babies crying and like I think there's a section talking about like babies eating other babies or some type of tissue and like the prominent features of like technical imagery, and I think one of the distorted movie skills is from scanners.
Yeah.
So that body horror imagery kind of is so beautifully incorporated into the archive.
Cool. Yeah, that is like where I think there's a lot of bleed through between this kind of, broad sense of like pulling and collecting from random and sampling from random materials across the internet, and also digging back through, personal archives and abandoned texts that had been sitting, on old hard drives here, and trying to move between those different spaces and really to like fully integrate these things, producing like these weird, like emergent zones that are liminal spaces right between kind of this, basically where I am like coming into contact with the internet, and the bleed through between these personal kind of like notes and thoughts and reflections, and the way in which that just also becomes a Wikipedia article at certain moments.
Yeah, and even those start to corrupt. Like in the three appendices at the end of the book, you see the kerning start to kind of destroy itself and kind of cannibalize. But I'm also interested with that kind of accumulation. You ended up with a lot of supplementary material. Not only the pre-order chapbook that we've done, Exoskeletons, which is a very abridged version of the, I think, 60 cover ideas that you had.
Yeah.
But also, when we had been working through the editing, you had an additional 40-page document called Cellular Genesis that we had started to incorporate into this. So I'm curious kind of how that aggregation of materials happens with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's continuing on. I mean, I have another file that started of material that could easily plug right into what's happening in this text. In some ways, it sets itself up as some sort of continuation of that, but it's really hard for me to think of each of these projects as being distinct from one another. So much of my thinking is about this kind of continuity, maybe, between the variety of different projects, but at the same time, it's all like caught up in forms of fragmentation and rupture, glitch, right? These are all things that are also operative within the framework of these texts as well. Yeah. There's a lot of tension between those two types of modes of constructing environments and continually like modulating them as well.
Yeah, like so this is the chapbook we did, Exoskeletons, issue 1, and it reminds me of how these various covers, none of them actually have the title of your name on them. They're all kind of themselves corrupted or glitched, that the key information is missing. But it all feels so coherent with the book itself. Like it has that same kind of like, kind of smooth kind of spillage to it, with the really dramatic like black and white kind of corruptions. But I know that you've talked a lot about what you wrote your dissertation on, which is Vadic glitches, which is, and correct me if I'm wrong, I've read the dissertation, but I haven't studied up recently, but is glitches that are kind of promoted in the creation process, that you kind of create the space for it to happen as you're making the work. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Glitches are talked about like in so many different ways. I would, at the moment, like some of the maybe thinkers that kind of surround this thought that are worth checking out if people haven't. Rosa Mankman has some amazing work. Yeah, the Glitch Momentum. It also has like a Glitch Studies Manifesto, which is really great. Nick Briz is another person who's written a ton on glitch. So they have a lot to say about the movement between like technical glitches and then these broader implications within social systems, as well as like the political stakes. This is also more recently in Legacy Russell's book Glitch Feminism. You can see the way in which this actually moves, through a bunch of artists actually into the space of political and social environments, right? Thinking about kind of the points that emerge between these binary structures of around gender, right? And there's also a strong element of looking at race within Legacy Russell's work too. But my own focus was way more, I think, on looking at forms of digital materiality and thinking of the glitch as a way of revealing these material substrates, maybe less as a point of failure, right? Because when you can notice a glitch, something is still working, so it's just on the edge of functionality, kind of this new creative zone, but that can also be very easily used for or reincorporated within these larger structures and larger networks. That was starting obviously to go down into a realm. I've had this kind of framework related to the dissertation that's hard to rein in quickly. But yeah, glitches I think are really interesting because they do resist processes of incorporation, or are these moments that are at times really difficult to explain.
Yeah, there's a sense that they kind of provide evidence of the attempt, or of something, not necessarily the intended thing or what you expected, but there's still that evidence. We have a question from Anthony Macco asking about kind of that process of making digital waste physical, and what that was like for you.
Yeah, that's amazing. Hello, Anthony. The emphasis on waste, one is we'd like to obviously avoid this as a space, both within creative production, but then also larger zones of cultural, economic, right, and material production. There's so much forms of waste that become quite invisible to all of us, even though it is something that is continually surrounding us. And the internet itself is both a large producer of waste and also a space to continually reprocess these things and allow us to see the way in which it operates alongside what would maybe be seen as the valuable parts of the internet. I don't know if my audio something just shifted in my audio.
Oh, you're all good still.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, and I like that. I think that title of Zero Access really works into that, because it feels like you took these kind of abandoned digital zones and have made them into something kind of highlighted in this kind of physical space. That materiality is kind of revisited once it's put into print, and I think that's really kind of approaching that kind of subversion of what is waste.
Yeah. I mean, I think that those are interesting zones, right? What has been set aside? What are the things that people don't actually spend time either interrogating or engaging with?
Yeah.
I mean, part of that goes a little bit back to what you were just, when we were talking about glitch in particular. As it emerges in these unknown spaces, it's really hard to figure out how to assign agency, who is doing what or what is doing what. Is this the program itself? Is this a programmer? Is it the reader that's experiencing the glitch? Where is this rupture occurring? Who's causing it? And how is it then engaged with? The glitch could also be seen as a form of waste as well. Or it can be something that is highly aestheticized and becomes a background in a music video.
Yeah, and there's this way that it kind of gives the text itself this autonomy, because it's no longer kind of the author directing all of these components. You're allowing for the text to kind of create itself in those glitches, that you don't undo it and make it as the intended way, that you kind of step back and let the book or the archive kind of express its own message, which is really interesting, but also kind of terrifying in that, that faux sentience of the machine.
Yeah. I mean, that is one of the difficulties that I feel like I run into as someone trying to produce these types of objects is how to situate like the authorial role, and like what it is that like what is it that I am actually doing within this environment, and what are the limitations on that, and what is the actual potential of that type of positioning.
Yeah, and I've been interested with this idea of like evoking the muses, not in necessarily like a literal sense, but in the idea that you're kind of like letting it flow through you, or you're curating like what you're kind of experiencing and reflecting it back. That it doesn't necessarily have to come out of you, but you just kind of arrange the pile of things in front of you.
Yeah.
Like author as kind of collagist or craftsperson.
Yeah, or like data manager.
Yeah.
But also like it could just be trash collector. Like that's the right, the tension within that is like often it's reframed as like this highly curated kind of position, where it really could just be like I just pulled a file and threw it into a printed format.
I was cleaning up my hard drive on my old computer recently, and I was so tempted to take I had these corrupted game files that had been registered as like .txts, and so it was just all this raw like data, a bunch of like Boolean functions and things just put into Notepad, and it's so tempting when you see those kind of like those glitches to do something with them. It feels like you can't just allow them to be wasted a lot of the time. Like you start kind of finding this like aesthetic value in it once you start kind of noticing it more and more.
Yeah. And it also like provides ways of making things visible that often go unnoticed, but also provides a way to produce forms of invisibility or illegibility within these frameworks as well. So there is like a potential to make things present and also to obscure and hide.
Yeah. I completely agree. I'm seeing if I have. I wanted to talk about. There's this quality. I know we talk about the ambient with the project, but there's also this kind of investigative quality to it because you don't quite. There's so much ambiguity throughout the piece that you feel like you have to kind of slowly piece all these elements together, like you're trying to create this meaning out of the glitch, like you're trying to figure out how it all becomes this cohesive work. And there's this interesting point later in the book where it starts archiving itself. You start kind of getting these pages zoomed out and you see kind of the metadata around them and how they're being filed away within whatever larger kind of system. And so there's this even though it's ambient, this really kind of interesting progression to the piece that you're trying to understand as you move through it.
Yeah, like it turns into basically like an aestheticization of the archival process without the actual content of the archive, right? We have like this basically dead or empty archive that's produced through that process.
It's a directory of other directories. Directory, like there's no real file to find. You just keep finding more and more folders. Okay, we're hitting about 45 minutes, so I think it might be, if you either want to do a reading or if you wanted to kind of turn over to questions.
Yeah, if anyone has questions, that would be cool. And if no one does, we can also move into reading a bit of the text. I can also read for a minute and then a text appear, or like any sort of questions appear. I'll stop immediately.
And I'm tempted to see if I have the PDF and I can kind of show some of the visuals.
Oh, cool.
Because I feel it's such a...
it's a better way to experience it, I would say.
And so I can provide some of that element as you read.
Amazing. Yeah, I might just read from the beginning of it. Like the text is kind of broken into these large segments that move kind of rapidly. But I'll start reading, and then you can, I guess, just show whatever you think is worthwhile.
Yeah, I have to dig through my computer to find that.
Cool.
Yeah, I think that there's like a 15-second delay for the video, so people might be thinking about questions, and then we'll kind of get a delay.
Amazing. Cool. That'll work out perfectly then. Yeah. So people can throw their questions up as I'm reading, and then we can address those later, or we can make up other things to talk about. Okay, so the opening section is mediation landscape, section 0. Synthetic skin landscape, all inputs scattered across the surface, wires in parallel sets, an exposed multicolored rib cage, biocosmic distortion, stretch, the flesh plane flatness. Media fields proliferate through bioid networks, no need for reproduction when contagions accelerate the rate of replication. Ectodermic, border breach, seeping becomes fluid flows beyond membrane. Planetary skin surface glossed and plastic spread over all geographic anomalies, sculpting and seeping into the ridges still damp from the ocean depths. Lawn green, chartreuse, lime green, lime, forest green, green, dark green, yellow green, spring green, medium spring, light green, pale green, dark sea green, medium sea green, olive, dark olive green, olive drab. Possible simulations of anything other than imminent doom. Pollution wasn't difficult to comprehend. Debris and matter and sludge pool in human tubing and water bodies and dirt. When scaled up, the complexity seems to rot brain vats. Dark energy pollution at the global level sends error message through neural pathways, does not compute the possibility of disaster across massive geographic spaces, starts to melt and corrupt mental processing liquid plastic on cerebral cortex, another affect of our proximity to species death. Desire to speak dissipates, only silence and unsaying old rhythms. Might jump to a later section. Looking at section 4. Death to the motherfucking archive, long live the archive, pools of dead data, dead book and such, mutation and metallic lust surge, electric slime, non-human in the active internet. Humans are no longer operating the control codes. The internet is now over 50% non-human traffic, bots, scrapers, automated scripts, etc. The internet is mostly bots. More than half the web traffic comes from automated programs, many of them malicious. 24% of the internet web traffic, DDoS attacks. Not only is it not us, but it's mostly malicious. It's a dead zone. Nitol malware, a bot called Cyclone, meant to mimic Google's good search ranking bots, and Mirat malware, a virus that caused mass internet disruption. The internet doesn't really need to be remembered. We can still look at the screenshots of porn from 10 years ago. Some of the images don't load. Who gives a fuck? There's a strange sort of decay that happens when there are no fleshy bodies at stake. Obscene moving towards monstrous. Most of the content online isn't summoned. It just sits in coded bits on servers. These files aren't updated or maintained. They will eventually become incompatible for their platforms, unable to be displayed through various interfaces. Even when they are updated, the previous edition still exists, just accumulating in the junk pile that is most of the digital realm. The archive maintains a tension between its preservation of the past and future orientation. These two poles tend to leave out the present and the constant unfolding that is most visible and only momentarily visible online. It emerges and then slowly fades into the sea of data. To capture these moments is what is involved in archiving, but it also undoes the ephemerality that algorithms have come to expect and love. To archive is to copy and recreate. Every digital copy is a new object, an altered clone that now exists alongside the previous version. PDFs, JPEGs, movies, docs, HTML files, all are being reproduced whenever they are summoned, whenever they are downloaded. Cool. Might stop there.
Awesome. And I feel like that really captures a lot of what we were talking about with this idea of kind of taking those unseen parts of digital space and kind of redirecting them into this physical zone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it like moves pretty rapidly between these various registers.
Yeah. It looks like we have a question from Michael McGinnis. Can you talk more broadly about your view of books as a form of communication?
Hey, Mike. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, this, I think, I'm sure also, Mike Correa, you probably have some thoughts on this as well. But I'm, personally interested in the, first instance, like the materiality of the book and the way in which you can kind of manipulate it within your hands and move through it in a variety of different ways, engage with it. And, we've kind of adopted a pretty standard and like regimented approach to how we engage with books, but there's a variety of other ways that you can, and there are a lot of books that do resist that kind of format. And I think I am interested in forms of communication maybe that move beyond just like this seamless transfer of knowledge, or even the idea that is like a productive like line to go down all the time. I think there's something really valuable about coming up to a book and having to unpack and to, wrestle with the impenetrability of it or the opacity of this as an object in front of you.
Yeah, there's a kind of like labor that some of these books do. Like, kind of more traditional novels will kind of like lull you into that fantasy, and it becomes people like have compared to like it's a movie in your head and things like that, where it's just so kind of you're so smoothly kind of lulled into that world that there's no more labor. It's just kind of like this thing that you just watch it or kind of like passively interact with it. But these more impenetrable works put the reader in this more active position that you're working with or against the object that you're holding. That materiality really comes through. Human Tetris, another 1111 book, makes me think of this with the text running vertically. That you have to either physically turn the book or crane your neck. That there's this way that you have to interact with it in that kind of strictly one-to-one kind of like in the moment presence. That the book kind of refuses to just be that passive experience.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting that you bring in like the labor of the reader, because it also then brings some attention to the labor of the production of these objects and also of the writer. You'll see, I mean, this text has some like small errors that we actually held on to, right? And those reveal like that these were typed out on a computer. And a lot of that type of markup does, show these like traces of these various mediations that you can trace across the book object. That is some sort of record of those types of marks of inscription.
And they can become these very like visceral moments of like remembering that you were holding the book. That if in case you had started to kind of like dip into that smooth scan, then you suddenly remember like, yeah, I'm holding a book, someone wrote this, like there was a process that led to this object being in front of me. Like that kind of all comes to the surface once you notice these kind of abnormalities.
Yeah. And we do like there's like a tendency to like privilege forms of seamless media, where that is, I mean, in printed forms, right? You want something that you like look at the page. You don't have to even reflect on the fact that there was someone that wrote this, because you are just like immediately taking a lot of it in. Mm-hmm. And then that's true with other forms of media as well. Like people spend a lot of time pointing out the weird little flaws within a film if something is like left in a shot, or if you can see a mic or things like that, right? That really are part of the production process and are part of constructing these weird worlds. But I think there's something also valuable about seeing the construction itself and seeing these material elements kind of bleed into the space that the viewer, consumer is engaging with.
And it kind of takes up this interesting relationship between the production and the work itself, because it seems like a lot of kind of works that want to show the production more like the writer and their process of writing versus like the technical kind of shaping of the object. It usually focuses on like making the idea and like, how writing is so hard and things like that, and like writer's block and stuff like adaptation work. Like it's more interesting to me to think of like this thing got put together like as an object, not necessarily as like a story. Like I'm not necessarily interested in like the writer's kind of like woes. I want to see like what kind of strange processes led to this object coming together. A question from Andrew. I'll let you finish and then we can address Andrew's
I mean,
question.
the one thing with that, the object coming together, so there's like this construction of the physical book, and also the way in which that can rapidly take you out of the space of the page too, right? It can, like with this text, for example, like you can clearly see the markings of a Wikipedia page that kind of appear.
And you even see kind of like the citation needed kind of brackets around the word. And in the digital version, those are kind of blue as the hyperlinks would be.
Yeah.
And I think we actually let some of the hyperlinks towards the end alive, which kind of connect to this really esoteric religious database. And that kind of leads into Andrew's question about kind of the experience between the digital and the physical versions.
Yeah. Let me see. What is the question? What's your take on the digital versus physical book object reading? How does the reading experience change between these? Yeah. So the original project before, this is like a far more fleshed out version and a much more polished version, but I originally created this just as like a website with like just a side scroll that you would move between the pages basically as like this really seamless transition, but they were like blocks basically as pages. I was trying to imagine this as something that you would read on your phone and you could just quickly, slide through each of these sections that way. So that was like the starting point for this. So there was like a very kind of clear parameters on what it was that I wanted this thing to do and the way in which that was going to operate. And I think there are a lot of those things that also work really well within the kind of physical printed format, but also seem to retain some of that like disjointedness now that it is actually printed out, right? We have links in here that you no longer can follow. The metadata tags aren't going to take you anywhere, or allow you to organize this information more easily. And so I think that kind of process of like remediation or transcoding, I think draws more attention to the materiality of the object, which is something I'm like really interested in. That this is like a physical thing you can hold, you can page through it however you want. You don't actually have to look at the pages as you move your way through it, right? You can sit with it open next to you. And I've thought about this a lot and at some point I would love to write something about Grant's book, like just of carrying this thing around and the environments in which it is existed and the types of roles it is taken up as like a unread object. So engaging with it in its materiality, which is something, especially that book as like basically a brick, right, is really drawing attention to.
Yeah, and there's something about kind of I like what you talk about with the pages like that, or the book's nonlinearity, because I think that the way that the pages, which we saw a bit of during the reading, kind of really dramatically switch between like black and white, and their composition will be drastically different from one page to the next. So it's this sense of each page is its singular own piece, its own surface for you to engage with within kind of the larger scope of the book.
Yeah, that's something I'm like still trying to wrestle with is this desire to like draw attention to the materiality of the object, but then also to construct these environments, like this like more ambient sense of what the book is, and the way in which it can reframe things around it as a physical object as well. It can reconstruct the space in which it operates. Yeah. I'm not sure, how to play between those spaces, because books also can do incredible things where they lull you in, right, and really do some like weird transportive work.
And I think I told you this, but it was funny because when Andrew had first sent me this book, I was on break at work, and I ended up going dramatically over my break because I had just been lulled into the book. There was this way that even just the PDF version of this kind of sucked you in, and you started just kind of slowly scanning through it.
That's amazing.
It was such a great first experience with this. It was just being like, oh shit, I have to go back to my shift.
Yeah, that's like an incredible thing that books, I mean, I feel that experience less with engaging with anything that I've produced, but when a book really can kind of radically reconstruct time is a pretty incredible, that like also then takes us back into that kind of mystical realm, right, where there is something else happening here, moving between this concrete object and these more abstract spaces.
Yeah, it makes me think Metahaven has a work called Digital Tarkovsky when they talk about this as like the digital space being cinematic. One of the examples I bring up is dash cam footage. This kind of like largely uneventful thing that gets edited down to its very like kind of impactful moments. Mm-hmm. But that base footage is just kind of this ambience that is kind of all encompassing, and it's interesting to see a work trying to do that. Kind of picking up that same temporal mode that digital spaces tend to be able to capture.
Right. Yeah, I like want to see those hours of boring, still like if it's dashboard, just empty roads, right? Like just watching that for hours, or I've seen some of like the underwater cameras, right, that are near like reefs and things like that, where you can just watch a quiet ocean for hours on end.
Yeah, this sense of kind of like data that isn't necessarily like kind of antagonistic or necessarily like surveillance or oppressive, but still kind of this all kind of recording data that all of this information, no matter how mundane, is always getting kind of picked up and stored somewhere.
Yeah, and then like the process, as people who are making books, of like dealing with those difficulties of remediating that kind of content and figuring out what it would mean to produce that within the space of a book creates these new types of glitches that are worth spending time with.
Totally. And we've hit our hour of discussion.
Nice.
So I think we can open to some final questions if any folks kind of want to know more about the book or anything that we were talking about tonight.
Cool.
And at the end of the stream, after we've kind of wrapped up, we'll have a screen detailing our Big Cartel URL where you can order the book. It'll be out on Tuesday, on the 27th. Pre-orders are open right now for anybody interested. It's a really great book, pre-orders, and I believe kind of all the orders until we hit 100 will have the Exoskeletons Issue 1 chapbook included with them.
Amazing.
Which is, again, this beautiful little guy with its own cover, which I don't know, we could just keep going with issues. That issue 2 will be all the mock covers for issue 1. Keep building the labyrinth deeper and deeper.
That sounds wonderful. You also should go and buy Mike's book on 1111 Gut Text, which is amazing. And actually, like, is what signaled to me that this press and Andrew were going to be people that would be great to work with. So it seems like a text that'd be really hard to place, and has found a wonderful home and is a wonderful text.
Thank you. And I like the idea of it as a companion piece to Zero Access. That one's just its own, very much less digital and more just entities in the page, and yours is the digital becoming part of the page. I like that as like the spatial and the sentient kind of melding together between those two.
Yeah. I like to imagine they're sitting on a shelf next to one another somewhere.
I think they are on my shelf.
Perfect.
So hopefully that desire has come true immediately. But
yeah.
I think that'll wrap it up for tonight. It was a lot of fun talking to you, Jake.
Yeah, same. Thank you to everyone who came to watch and ask questions.
Yeah, some really great ones from Michael and Anthony and Andrew and Grant.
Yeah.
So thank you for showing up, everyone, and we'll call it a night, and we'll have the pre-order link come up.
Cool. See ya.